Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a huge difference for us. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. If this is your first time here and you're enjoying what you hear, consider subscribing. We've got plenty more mysteries to explore together. 13 ships cut through the Southern Ocean, their hulls groaning against the pack ice. Over 4,000 men, bundled against winds that could freeze exposed skin in minutes, watched as the white horizon grew closer. They were heading toward the most hostile environment on Earth. This wasn't an expedition. It was an invasion force. The mission was called Operation High Jump. The official story was simple. Cold weather training, equipment testing, mapping uncharted territory. 6 to 8 months of scientific work in the Antarctic summer. But 58 days later, the ships would turn around and flee north. Aircraft would be lost under circumstances that remain unexplained. Reports would be sealed, and the man who led the expedition, Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd, would spend the rest of his life issuing warnings that made no sense for someone who had merely completed a training exercise. He would warn of threats from the polar regions. He would speak of future wars coming from the south. He would give interviews that were quickly buried, his words dismissed or ignored. What happened down there in the ice? What did they find that made the largest Antarctic expedition in history end so suddenly, so quietly, so completely? This is that story. Part 1. The fleet that shouldn't have been necessary. The war ended in August of 1945. By September, the American military was in full demobilization mode. Millions of men were being discharged, ships were being mothballed, aircraft were being scrapped or put into storage. The entire industrial war machine that had defeated Germany and Japan was winding down as fast as bureaucracy would allow. America was tired, Europe was in ruins, Japan was occupied. The Soviet Union was consolidating its grip on Eastern Europe. Nobody wanted another war. Nobody wanted more sacrifice. And yet, barely 14 months after the surrender of Japan, the United States Navy assembled one of the largest task forces since the end of the war. Destination Antarctica. The announcement came in November of 1946. The Navy would launch Operation High Jump, described as a comprehensive scientific and training expedition to Antarctica. The operation would test equipment in extreme cold, improve polar navigation techniques, map uncharted regions of the continent, and establish an American presence before other nations could claim strategic advantages. On paper it sounded reasonable, but the numbers told a different story. 13 ships. Not small research vessels, but major naval assets. The aircraft carrier Philippine Sea, a 27,000-ton Essex-class carrier that had served in the Pacific War, the submarine Senate, a Balao-class attack submarine, the destroyer Brownson, the icebreaker North Wind, seaplane tenders Pine Island and Currituck, cargo ships, tankers, supply vessels, each one representing millions of dollars in operational costs, over 4,000 personnel, not scientists, sailors, marines, pilots, combat veterans who had fought at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, who had sailed through kamikaze attacks, who knew what it meant to face death. 6 R-4D aircraft, the Navy version of the Douglas C-47 Skytrain, 6 Martin PBM Mariner flying boats, 6 helicopters, ground vehicles, prefabricated buildings, enough supplies and equipment to support a small city. This was not a research mission. This was a military deployment. The operation was divided into 3 task groups. Task Force 68, under the command of Rear Admiral Richard H. Cruzen, would handle overall naval operations. The central group would establish a base on the Ross Ice Shelf and conduct inland reconnaissance. The western group would explore and map the Pacific coast of Antarctica. The eastern group would chart the Indian Ocean coastline. Together they would photograph and map nearly 70% of the Antarctic coast, covering more than 1.5 million square miles. An area larger than India, Leading the entire operation was Rear Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd Jr., the most famous polar explorer in American history. Byrd was a legend, a Naval Academy graduate who had learned to fly in World War I, a man who claimed to be the first to fly over the North Pole in 1926, though that claim would be disputed for decades. A man who had led multiple expeditions to Antarctica, discovering mountain ranges, establishing bases, spending a winter alone in a weather station where he nearly died from carbon monoxide poisoning. He had written books, given lectures, been featured in newsreels, appeared on radio programs. He was America's face of polar exploration, a genuine hero in an age when heroes mattered. But Byrd was not really in command of Operation High Jump, not entirely. Overall operational control fell to Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the man who had commanded the entire Pacific Fleet during World War II. Nimitz was not an explorer. He was a warrior, a strategist who had orchestrated the island-hopping campaign that destroyed the Japanese Navy, a man who understood power projection, logistics, and the calculated use of force. Why would the Navy place a wartime fleet admiral in charge of what was supposedly a peacetime scientific expedition? The official answer was simple. The Navy wanted to demonstrate readiness. They wanted to prove that American forces could deploy anywhere, operate in any environment, maintain supply lines across impossible distances. But there was another reason, one that wasn't advertised. The world was changing. Fast. The alliance with the Soviet Union was already fracturing. Churchill had given his Iron Curtain speech in March of 1946, warning that Europe was being divided. Soviet forces occupied eastern Germany, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria. Communist parties were gaining strength in France and Italy. Stalin was making moves in Iran and Turkey, and both superpowers were racing to scoop up German scientists, engineers, and research data. Operation Paperclip was already underway. Werner von Braun and hundreds of other German rocket scientists were being brought to America. The Soviets were doing the same, capturing their own share of German expertise. Everyone wanted to know what Germany had been working on in the final years of the war, what wonder weapons had been in development, what technologies might give one side an advantage in the coming conflict. And some of that research, according to certain reports, had been conducted in the most remote location imaginable. Antarctica. The fleet departed Norfolk, Virginia on December 2nd, 1946. Crowds gathered to watch the ships leave. Newsreel cameras captured footage of sailors waving from the decks, aircraft secured on the carrier's flight deck, supplies being loaded in a choreographed dance of military precision. The public was told this was a bold scientific endeavour, a demonstration of American ingenuity and determination. Another victory for Admiral Byrd, the conqueror of the poles. But the sailors knew better. They had seen combat. They recognised the difference between a research mission and something else. This was something else. The first leg of the journey took them to Panama, through the canal, and down the western coast of South America. They stopped in Chile to refuel and resupply, and it was in Chile that Byrd gave his first interview about the mission. He was optimistic, confident. He spoke about the importance of polar research, about America's commitment to science, about the opportunities that Antarctica represented. But there was something in his words, a subtle undercurrent that wouldn't make sense until later. He mentioned that Antarctica represented the last unexplored frontier on Earth, that it was a place where anything might be discovered, that the expedition would push the boundaries of human knowledge, standard exploration rhetoric. Except for one phrase. He said that Antarctica might hold secrets that would change everything we thought we knew about the world. At the time, nobody paid much attention. Byrd was known for dramatic statements. He was selling the mission, generating public interest. But those words would echo differently after the ships returned. The task force reached Antarctic waters in late December. The ships pushed through increasingly heavy pack ice. The temperature dropped below zero. Wind speeds increased. The sky took on that peculiar quality unique to high latitudes, where the sun never quite sets but circles endlessly around the horizon, the men began to understand what they were facing. Antarctica is not like other cold places. It's not like winter in Alaska or Canada or Siberia. Those places have land, vegetation, some measure of shelter. Antarctica has none of that. It's a continent of ice sitting on bedrock surrounded by the coldest ocean on Earth. 98% of it is covered by ice sheets that are on average 1 mile thick. Some places the ice is over 2.5 miles deep. The coldest temperature ever recorded on Earth was measured in Antarctica, minus 128.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough to freeze fuel, cold enough to shatter steel, cold enough to kill a man in minutes if he's not properly protected. The winds are worse than the cold. Katabatic winds, formed when dense cold air flows down from the high interior plateau toward the coast, can exceed 200 miles per hour. They create whiteout conditions that make navigation impossible. They generate waves that can swamp ships. They turn flying into a form of suicide. And then there's the isolation. Antarctica is the most remote place on Earth. If something goes wrong, if you need rescue, if your ship sinks or your plane crashes, there's nobody coming. The nearest help is thousands of miles away, across the most violent ocean in the world. The men of Operation High Jump knew all this. They had been briefed. They had trained. They thought they were prepared. But knowing about Antarctica and experiencing Antarctica are two very different things. On December 26th, the Central Group began establishing Little America 4 on the Ross Ice Shelf. This would be the main base of operations, the staging point for flights into the interior. The location had been chosen carefully. Byrd had established previous Little America bases in this region during his earlier expeditions in the 1920s and 30s. The Ross Ice Shelf is a massive platform of floating ice, roughly the size of France, extending from the coast into the Ross Sea. It's relatively flat, stable enough to support buildings and aircraft, and provides access to the interior via natural pathways through the mountains. Prefabricated structures were unloaded from the ships and assembled on the ice. Quonset huts for housing, buildings for operations, communications, supplies, aircraft hangars, fuel depots, a small city rising from the frozen wasteland. It was brutally difficult work. Men worked in shifts, taking breaks to warm up before going back out. Equipment froze. Engines wouldn't start. Metal became brittle and broke. Every task took 3 times longer than it would have in normal conditions, but they made progress. By early January, Little America 4 was operational. The base had power, heat, communications. Aircraft were assembled and tested. Seaplanes from the Pine Island and Currituck began flying reconnaissance missions along the coast, and then came the deep penetration flights. Part 2. Into the White Hell. Lieutenant Commander William Kearns was a pilot with extensive experience in cold weather operations. He had flown in Alaska. He understood ice, wind, and the unique challenges of polar aviation. On January 11th, 1947, Kearns took off from the North Wind in a small helicopter to scout for better landing sites for cargo operations. The weather was marginal, but acceptable. Visibility was reasonable. He had radio contact with the ship. 20 minutes later, his helicopter disappeared. Radio contact was lost. Search aircraft were launched, but found nothing. The helicopter had simply vanished into the white landscape. Kearns was alone, somewhere on the Antarctic ice with minimal supplies and no shelter. The temperature was below zero. Winds were increasing. A storm was moving in. He should have died within hours. Everyone assumed he was dead. But 6 weeks later, Kearns walked back into Little America 4. He was frostbitten, emaciated, barely able to walk. He had survived by finding a crevasse that provided shelter from the wind, by rationing the little food he had, by melting ice for water, by sheer force of will. When he was debriefed, Kearns described his experience in detail. The cold, the wind, the absolute isolation, the knowledge that he was utterly alone in the most hostile place on Earth. But there was something else in his report, something that was noted but not emphasized. During his time on the ice, Kearns reported seeing lights in the sky. Not the aurora australis, which he knew well. Something else. Lights that moved in ways that didn't match aircraft or natural phenomena. He was questioned about this. The debriefers wanted details. What did the lights look like? How did they move? How far away were they? Kearns couldn't be specific. He admitted that his mental state was compromised by starvation and cold. He said he might have hallucinated. The report was noted and filed away. But it wasn't the last time personnel from Operation High Jump would report unusual lights. While Kearns was lost on the ice, the main operations of High Jump were proceeding. The seaplane tenders Pine Island and Currituck were conducting extensive photographic reconnaissance along the coast. The Martin PBM mariners would take off from the water, fly low over the coastline, and photograph everything they saw. These were dangerous flights. The mariners were big, slow aircraft. They were vulnerable to wind shear and icing. If an engine failed, if the weather turned bad, if something went wrong, there was nowhere to land. The pilots would have to ditch in the freezing ocean and hope for rescue before hypothermia killed them. On January 30th, a mariner designated George 1 took off from the Pine Island for a routine coastal reconnaissance mission. The crew consisted of 9 men, led by Lieutenant Commander Ralph Frenchy LeBlanc. The weather was deteriorating, but still within acceptable limits. The George 1 flew along the coast, taking photographs, maintaining radio contact. Then, around noon, the weather turned savage. A blizzard swept in from the interior, visibility dropped to 0, winds exceeded 70 miles per hour. The George 1 tried to return to the Pine Island. Radio contact became intermittent. The last transmission was LeBlanc reporting heavy turbulence and icing, then silence. Search aircraft were launched as soon as the weather permitted. They found wreckage scattered across the ice. The George 1 had crashed. 3 men were killed on impact. The other 6 survived, but they were stranded miles from any help. Rescue operations began immediately. Aircraft dropped supplies. Ships tried to reach the crash site, but were blocked by ice. The survivors huddled in the wreckage, burning whatever they could for heat, rationing emergency supplies. It took 3 days to reach them. 3 days in the Antarctic cold with inadequate shelter, knowing that every hour increased the risk of death from exposure. All 6 survivors were eventually rescued, but several suffered severe frostbite. 1 man lost parts of both feet to amputation. The official report listed the cause of the crash as extreme weather and pilot error. LeBlanc had pushed too far into deteriorating conditions. He had made a judgment call that turned out to be wrong, but some of the survivors told a different story. According to their accounts, which were included in initial debriefing reports, but later removed from official documents, the George 1 encountered something in the storm, something that interfered with their instruments, something that caused the engines to sputter and lose power. They described seeing shapes in the clouds, objects that moved independently of the wind, reflections of light that shouldn't have been there. Again, the reports were attributed to stress and the disorienting nature of Antarctic weather. Whiteout conditions can create optical illusions. Desperate men see what they want to see or fear to see. The reports were noted and filed. The official narrative remained unchanged. Pilot error, bad weather, a tragic but understandable accident. But then came Richard Byrd's flight. Part 3. The flight that changed everything. On February 19th, 1947, Rear Admiral Richard Byrd boarded a ski-equipped R-4D aircraft at Little America 4. The aircraft was designated Pine Island Express, piloted by Lieutenant Commander David Bunger. The mission was ambitious: fly south from the Ross Ice Shelf, penetrate deep into the Antarctic interior, conduct photographic reconnaissance of unexplored territory, and return before fuel ran low. It would be the longest and deepest penetration flight of Operation High Jump. A chance to see what lay beyond the coastal mountains, beyond the regions that previous expeditions had mapped. Byrd had made similar flights before. In 1929, during his first Antarctic expedition, he had flown over the South Pole itself, becoming one of the first men to do so. He understood the risks. He knew what could go wrong, but this flight would be different. The The R-Force D took off at 0700 hours. Weather conditions were excellent. Clear skies, low winds, temperature at minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, which was practically warm by Antarctic standards. The aircraft climbed to 10,000 feet and turned south. Below them, the Ross ice shelf stretched away like an endless frozen ocean. Ahead, the Transantarctic mountains rose like a wall, their peaks jutting above the ice, sharp and black against the white landscape. Bird sat in the co-pilot seat, watching the terrain pass beneath them. He had a camera mounted to the window, taking photographs at regular intervals. Other crew members operated additional cameras, mapping equipment and scientific instruments. The flight plan called for them to cross the mountains through a pass and then fly inland for several hours, photographing whatever they found. The interior of Antarctica was largely unknown. Satellite imagery didn't exist. The only way to map the continent was to fly over it and take pictures. They crossed the mountains without incident. On the far side, the terrain changed dramatically. Instead of ice shelf, they saw high plateau. Vast expanses of ice broken by exposed rock formations. Mountain ranges jutting up from the frozen surface. Valleys and crevasses that appeared to drop into bottomless darkness. Bird noted landmarks, compared them to previous maps, tried to orient himself. But this was virgin territory. Nothing he saw matched anything in the charts. 2 hours into the flight, as they approached what Bird estimated to be 85 degrees south, something changed. The instruments began acting strangely. The magnetic compass, which was already unreliable at high latitudes, started spinning. The altimeter fluctuated. Radio contact with Little America became distorted, filled with static and interference. Bunga the pilot reported the instrument problems. He suggested they turn back, that something was wrong with the aircraft's electrical systems. But Bird wanted to continue. They had come this far. The weather was good. They had fuel for another hour of exploration. They flew on. And then, according to accounts that emerged decades later, they saw something that shouldn't have existed. The official flight logs from February 19th are sparse. They record the takeoff time, the route flown, the time aloft, and the landing back at Little America. Total flight time, 6 hours and 13 minutes. Distance covered, approximately 1,700 miles. But there's a gap in the logs, a period of roughly 45 minutes where no entries were made, no notes about terrain observed, no photographs logged, nothing. After Bird's death in 1957, a document began circulating among researchers interested in Antarctic mysteries. The document was presented as a diary entry from Bird's personal journal, dated February 19th, 1947. The diary entry described what happened during that 45-minute gap. According to this document, the R4D encountered unusual atmospheric conditions as they flew deeper inland. The air became warmer, the instruments went haywire, and ahead of them, the landscape changed. The diary described seeing a valley not covered in ice, vegetation, flowing water, and then something that defied all logic. Aircraft. But not conventional aircraft. Disc-shaped craft that moved at incredible speed, performing manoeuvres that no known plane could achieve. Vertical ascent, instant acceleration, flight patterns that seemed to ignore basic physics. The diary claimed that one of these craft paced the R4D, flying alongside at close range. That radio contact was established, though the source of the transmission was unclear, that Bird was instructed to follow the craft. According to the diary, Bunga had no choice. When he tried to turn away, the aircraft's controls became unresponsive. They were being guided remotely by whatever intelligence was controlling the craft. They were led to a landing site. The diary described it as a massive opening in the ice, leading down into what appeared to be a subterranean world. Warm air rising from below, light that didn't come from the sun. The R4D landed according to this account. Bird and his crew were met by figures described as tall, blonde, and speaking in accented English. They claimed to represent a civilization that had been observing humanity's development. They expressed concern about humanity's recent use of atomic weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They warned that continued nuclear testing could have catastrophic consequences. Byrd was given a message to deliver to the leaders of the surface world, a warning about the destructive path humanity was taking, an offer of assistance if humanity chose a different course. And then, according to the diary, Byrd was escorted back to his aircraft and released. The flight back to Little America was uneventful, but he was informed that his report would not be believed, that he would be silenced, that the world was not ready for the truth. Mainstream historians and researchers dismiss this diary as a complete fabrication. They point out multiple problems with it. First, the diary didn't surface until decades after Byrd's death, making authentication impossible. Second, the writing style doesn't match Byrd's known journals and reports. Third, many of the details seem to be borrowed from science fiction stories popular in the 1950s and 60s. Fourth, there's no corroborating evidence from any of the crew members who were supposedly on the flight. The diary is almost certainly fake, a hoax created to feed conspiracy theories about Hollow Earth, Nazi bases, and alien contact. But here's the problem. Some of the geographic features described in the diary match real locations in Antarctica that were not publicly known until satellite mapping became available in the 1970s and 80s. The diary mentioned specific mountain ranges, valleys and ice formations that would have been nearly impossible for a forger to know about unless they had access to classified reconnaissance data. And there's another problem. Richard Byrd's behaviour after Operation High Jump. If the mission had been routine, if nothing unusual had happened, you would expect Byrd to return home, write reports, give lectures, and continue his career as America's foremost polar explorer. But that's not what happened. Part 4. The warning nobody wanted to hear. On March 5th, 1947, barely a week after returning from Antarctica, Richard Byrd gave an interview to Lee Van Atta, a reporter for International News Service. The interview was conducted in Chile, where the task force had stopped to refuel before the final leg home. The interview was published in El Mercurio, a Chilean newspaper, on March 5th. The headline read, "Admiral Richard E. Byrd refers to strategic importance of the poles." In the interview, Byrd made a series of statements that seemed bizarre for someone who had just completed a training and mapping exercise. He said, and this is a direct quote from the translation of the article, "It is necessary for the United States to take defensive actions against enemy air fighters which come from the polar regions. The United States must adopt measures of protection against the possibility of an invasion of the country by hostile aircraft proceeding from the polar regions." He elaborated, saying that in the case of a future war, America could be attacked by aircraft capable of flying from pole to pole at tremendous speeds. These statements made no sense in context. Who was going to attack America from Antarctica? The nearest hostile nation, the Soviet Union, was in the Northern Hemisphere. There were no military bases in Antarctica, no aircraft capable of the kind of pole-to-pole flight Byrd was describing. What was he talking about? The interview received a limited coverage in the United States. A few newspapers picked it up, but it was largely buried beneath other post-war news. Most readers who saw it probably assumed Byrd was talking about the Soviet threat, about the possibility of long-range bombers flying over the North Pole to attack American cities. But Byrd specifically mentioned both poles. He emphasized Antarctica. He spoke of aircraft with capabilities that exceeded anything in the known arsenals of any nation. When questioned about the statements, later Byrd was evasive. He said he had been misquoted, that the translation from English to Spanish and back had distorted his meaning, that he was simply emphasizing the strategic importance of polar regions in general. But the original article exists. The quotes are there. Whatever Byrd meant, he said something about Antarctic threats that he would spend the rest of his life trying to clarify, downplay or avoid discussing entirely. The Navy's official response was silence. No comment on Byrd's statements. No clarification of what he meant. No correction if he had been misquoted. Just silence. Operation High Jump officially ended in late February of 1947. The ships returned to the United States in April. The personnel were debriefed, demobilised and sent home or reassigned to other duties. The mission was declared a success. Nearly 70,000 aerial photographs had been taken, mapping vast stretches of previously unknown coastline. Valuable data had been gathered on cold weather operations. Equipment had been tested in extreme conditions. But the operation had ended 2 months earlier than planned. The official explanation was weather and logistical challenges. But insiders knew that wasn't the full story. Aircraft losses had been higher than expected. The George I crash was public knowledge, but other incidents were not reported. There were rumours of additional aircraft that had been damaged or lost, records that didn't quite add up, flight logs with unexplained gaps. Personnel injuries were another issue. Several men had suffered severe frostbite. Others had psychological issues, what we would now recognise as PTSD but was then dismissed as weakness or nerves. Some men reported nightmares. Others refused to talk about their experiences. The after-action reports were classified. Not unusual for military operations, but the level of classification seemed excessive for what was supposed to be a scientific and training mission. Specific sections were marked above top secret. Access was restricted to a small number of officials. Even requesting to see the reports required special clearance. Why? The Navy's answer was strategic sensitivity. The reports contained information about naval capabilities, operational procedures, and equipment performance that could be valuable to potential adversaries. Standard security protocol. But researchers who later gained partial access to declassified versions of the reports noticed something strange. The redactions weren't limited to technical data or operational details. Entire sections describing specific flights and observations were blacked out. Place names were removed. Personnel names were deleted. It looked less like protecting military secrets and more like hiding something embarrassing or inexplicable. Richard Byrd remained in the Navy after high jump. He was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1947. He participated in various naval functions and continued to advise on polar operations, but he never led another major Antarctic expedition. He participated in later missions like Operation Deep Freeze in 1955, but always in a supporting or advisory role. He gave fewer public lectures. He wrote less. He seemed to withdraw from the public spotlight that had defined much of his earlier career. Those who knew him personally said he changed after high jump. He became more serious, more guarded. He would avoid certain topics in conversation. If asked directly about what he saw in Antarctica, he would give vague answers or change the subject. Something had happened to Richard Byrd in Antarctica. Whether it was what the fake diary described or something else entirely, he carried it with him for the rest of his life, and he was not allowed to talk about it. Part 5. The Theory That Won't Die. Nazi Germany's interest in Antarctica began long before World War II. In the 1930s, Germany's whaling industry was among the most productive in the world. Whale oil was valuable for making margarine, soap, and industrial lubricants. The richest whaling grounds were in the waters around Antarctica. But Germany's interest went beyond commercial whaling. There were strategic considerations as well. In 1938 and 39, a German expedition led by Captain Alfred Richter conducted extensive aerial reconnaissance of a region in Antarctica called Queen Maud Land. The expedition used a converted aircraft carrier, the Schwabenland, equipped with special catapult-launched seaplanes. The aircraft flew over thousands of square miles of territory, taking photographs, dropping German flags with swastika emblems, claiming the region for the Third Reich. They named it Neuschwabenland, New Swabia. The official purpose was to support German whaling operations and establish territorial claims before other nations could do so. But conspiracy theories suggest something more. Some researchers believe the Germans discovered something in Neuschwabenland. Natural caverns beneath the ice, geothermal vents providing warmth, areas where a base could be established away from the brutal surface conditions. According to these theories, Germany began constructing a secret research facility in Antarctica before the war began. When it became clear that Germany was losing in Europe, resources and personnel were supposedly evacuated to this facility to continue advanced research projects. The most common version of this theory focuses on flying disc technology. Germany did experiment with unconventional aircraft designs during the war. The Horten brothers developed flying wing designs. BMW and other companies researched vertical takeoff aircraft. There were projects with code names like Vril and Haunebu that supposedly involved disc-shaped craft. Most mainstream historians consider these projects to be either complete fabrications or wildly exaggerated accounts of conventional research. The few documents that reference unusual aircraft designs show concepts that never progressed beyond the blueprint stage. But conspiracy theorists argue that the real research was conducted in Antarctica, away from Allied bombing raids and intelligence gathering, that the disc technology was successfully developed and tested in the isolated environment of Neuschwabenland, and that when Operation High Jump arrived in early 1947, American forces encountered this technology. The theory suggests that reconnaissance flights from High Jump penetrated into German-held territory, that they discovered the base, that they were intercepted by advanced craft capable of outmaneuvering conventional aircraft, that aircraft were damaged or destroyed, that the Navy realised they were facing an opponent with superior technology, that they withdrew to avoid further losses and began developing countermeasures. This theory has several problems. First, there's the logistical impossibility of maintaining a secret Antarctic base. Such a facility would require constant resupply. Food, fuel, equipment, personnel rotations. Ships would have to make regular trips from South America or Africa. These voyages would be noticed. No evidence exists of regular German shipping to Antarctica after 1945. No reports of suspicious vessels. No fuel consumption records that suggest such operations. Second, there's the technological leap required. Even if Germany had been working on advanced propulsion systems, developing functional aircraft that could defeat American planes in combat would require enormous resources, extensive testing, and time, all while isolated in the most hostile environment on Earth. Third, there's the question of motivation. If Germany had such advanced technology, why didn't they use it during the war? Why wait until after defeat to demonstrate capabilities that could have changed the outcome of the conflict? The standard answer from conspiracy theorists is that the technology wasn't ready until after the war ended, that it required years of development in the Antarctic facility before becoming operational. But this stretches credulity. However, there is one detail that keeps this theory alive. In 1947, shortly after Operation High Jump ended, the United States military began encountering what they initially called flying discs. The Kenneth Arnold sighting in June, where a pilot reported seeing 9 unusual craft near Mount Rainier. The Roswell incident in July, where something crashed in the New Mexico desert, and the military initially announced they had recovered a flying disc before quickly retracting the statement. Throughout the late 1940s and early 50s, military and civilian pilots reported encountering disc-shaped craft with extraordinary performance characteristics, objects that could accelerate faster than jets, objects that could hover, then shoot away at impossible speeds, objects that seemed to ignore the laws of physics. The Air Force launched Project Sign in 1948 to investigate these reports. Project Sign concluded that some of the sightings represented technology beyond known human capabilities. The report, known as the Estimate of the Situation, suggested that the objects might be extraterrestrial. This conclusion was rejected by Air Force leadership. Project Sign was replaced by Project Grudge, which took a more sceptical approach, attributing most sightings to misidentifications, hoaxes, or psychological factors. But the sightings continued, and some of them came from Antarctica. Research stations established in Antarctica during the International Geophysical Year in 1957 and 58 reported unusual aerial phenomena. Lights moving across the sky, objects that appeared on radar but had no known source, craft that seemed to observe the stations before departing at high speed. Most of these reports were dismissed as atmospheric phenomena, the aurora australis, ice crystals in the air creating optical illusions, reflections from the sun or moon. But experienced observers, people who had spent years in Antarctica and knew what natural phenomena looked like, insisted that what they saw was something else. Which brings us to an even stranger theory. What if the craft encountered during Operation High Jump weren't German at all? What if they were never human? Part 6. The possibility nobody wants to consider Antarctica is the most isolated continent on Earth. It has no permanent human population. Until the mid-20th century, it was almost completely unexplored. Even today, vast regions remain unmapped at ground level. If you were a non-human intelligence and you wanted a base of operations on Earth, a place where you could conduct activities without human interference, Antarctica would be ideal. The environment is hostile enough to discourage casual exploration. The isolation ensures that any facility could operate for extended periods without detection. The ice provides natural concealment, and the international treaty system that emerged in the 1950s effectively restricts military presence and limits access. This is, of course, pure speculation, but let's examine what we know. Richard Byrd warned of threats from the polar regions. He specifically mentioned aircraft capable of flying pole to pole at tremendous speeds. He emphasised Antarctica as a potential source of danger. Why would he say this if the threats were conventional? If he was concerned about Soviet expansion, he would have said so. If he was worried about German holdouts, he would have been specific. Instead, he used vague language. He spoke of capabilities that exceeded known technology. He framed Antarctica itself as a source of danger, not just a location where hostile forces might operate. The classified sections of Operation Highjump reports remain sealed. Some documents have been declassified over the years, but key sections are still redacted or restricted. For a mission that ended over 70 years ago, the continued secrecy is unusual. What could possibly still require protection? If the mission was simply a training exercise that failed due to bad weather and equipment problems, there would be no need for ongoing classification. Technical details about 1940s-era equipment would be obsolete. Strategic assessments of Antarctic geography would be superseded by modern satellite imagery. Unless the classified sections contain information that remains sensitive because it describes something that still exists, something that governments still monitor, something that still represents an unknown. The Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959, barely 12 years after Operation Highjump. The treaty effectively demilitarized the entire continent. No weapons testing, no military bases, no territorial claims enforced. The United States and Soviet Union, locked in the most intense geopolitical rivalry in human history, agreed to completely neutralize Antarctica. Think about that. Two superpowers, racing to build nuclear arsenals, competing for influence on every continent, agreed that Antarctica would be off limits. Why? The official answer is scientific cooperation and environmental protection, both noble goals, but consider the alternatives. What if both nations discovered something in Antarctica? What if they independently encountered the same phenomenon that Operation Highjump encountered? What if they realised that military activity in Antarctica was either futile or dangerous? What if the treaty wasn't designed to protect Antarctica from humanity, but to protect humanity from making a terrible mistake in Antarctica? This is where we enter the realm of high speculation. But the questions remain valid. If non-human intelligence was operating in Antarctica, what would they want? Why would they tolerate human presence in research stations but restrict deeper exploration? One theory suggests that Antarctica serves as a monitoring station, that the non-human presence is observational, not interventional, that they allow limited human activity but discourage military operations or extensive resource extraction. This would explain why research stations are allowed to operate, why scientific expeditions are approved, but why certain regions remain off limits, why permits for independent exploration are difficult to obtain, why satellite imagery of some areas is restricted or low resolution. Another theory is darker. It suggests that Antarctica contains something ancient, something that predates human civilization, something buried beneath the ice that certain powers want to keep hidden. Antarctica was not always frozen. Geological evidence shows that millions of years ago the continent had a temperate climate. Forests grew there, animals lived there, and then as tectonic plates shifted and ocean currents changed, Antarctica migrated to the South Pole and began to freeze. What if something existed in Antarctica before the ice? What if structures, technology, or knowledge lies buried beneath miles of ice? What if Operation Highjump was not the first to discover this, but merely the most recent? Ancient civilization theories are popular in fringe research. The idea that advanced cultures existed before recorded history, that they possessed knowledge or technology that was lost when they collapsed, that evidence of these civilizations remains hidden in remote locations. Antarctica is a natural candidate for such theories. It's isolated, it's largely unexplored, and anything beneath the ice would be perfectly preserved, frozen in time. But these theories require accepting that mainstream archaeology and history are fundamentally wrong. That there were advanced civilizations before Sumer and Egypt, that they left no trace except in the most remote and inaccessible locations. Possible? Perhaps. Likely. That's harder to argue. But what if we're asking the wrong questions? What if the presence in Antarctica is not ancient but recent? What if it's not buried but active? What if it's not historical but ongoing? What if something lives in Antarctica, and Operation High Jump was the first time modern humanity encountered it directly? Part 7. The silence that followed. After Operation High Jump ended, and the controversy around bird statements faded from the news, Antarctica disappeared from public consciousness. There were no major expeditions for several years. The Navy conducted limited operations, maintaining weather stations and conducting basic research, but nothing on the scale of High Jump, and then came the International Geophysical Year. In 1957 and 1958, the international scientific community organised a massive coordinated research effort spanning the entire globe. The goal was to gather data on everything from solar activity to ocean currents to polar ice. Antarctica was a major focus. 12 nations established research stations on the continent. The United States built several bases, including McMurdo Station on Ross Island and the Amundsen Scott Station at the South Pole itself. Richard Byrd participated in the early stages of this effort as part of Operation Deep Freeze, the military operation that supported the scientific missions. He flew to Antarctica one last time in January of 1956, but his role was ceremonial. He attended the dedication of the new stations. He posed for photographs. He gave brief statements to the press about the importance of international cooperation, and then he returned home. Byrd died on March 11th, 1957, at the age of 68. The official cause of death was heart disease. He had lived a hard life. The years of cold, isolation, and physical hardship had taken their toll. His funeral was attended by dignitaries, fellow explorers, and military officials. He was eulogized as a hero of American exploration, a man who had pushed the boundaries of human achievement. But some who knew him said he died with unfinished business, that there were things he had wanted to say but couldn't, that he had been constrained by classification orders, by political pressure, by the weight of secrets he wasn't allowed to share. His personal papers were donated to the Byrd Polar Research Center at Ohio State University. Researchers have examined them extensively. His journals, his correspondence, his official reports. Nothing in the public archive supports the conspiracy theories. There are no references to underground civilizations or advanced craft or warnings from non-human intelligence. But there are gaps, periods where Byrd's personal journal has no entries, days unaccounted for, and in his later years, cryptic references to things he had seen but couldn't discuss. In a letter to a friend written in 1955, Byrd mentioned that he had knowledge that would shake the world if it were revealed, that he hoped someday the truth could be told, that future generations would understand what his generation had faced. What did he mean? Was it just the musings of an aging explorer reflecting on his legacy, or was it something more? We will never know. What we do know is that Antarctica remains restricted. The treaty holds, military activity is banned, independent exploration is tightly controlled. Satellite imagery has revealed the continent in unprecedented detail. We can see mountain ranges, valleys, lakes beneath the ice, the flow patterns of glaciers. But there are limits to what satellites can detect. Ice is opaque to most sensors. Ground-penetrating radar can help, but coverage is limited and expensive. Most of Antarctica's subterranean features remain unknown, and there are regions where satellite imagery is deliberately restricted or delayed before public release, areas where coverage is lower resolution than it should be. zones where access requires special permissions. Why? The official answer is always the same: environmental protection, scientific integrity, preventing contamination of pristine ecosystems. All reasonable, all true to an extent. But when you combine these restrictions with the history of Operation High Jump, with the sealed records and unexplained incidents, with Byrd's warnings and the rapid establishment of the Antarctic Treaty, a pattern emerges. Antarctica is hiding something, and those in power want it to stay hidden. Part 8. What the evidence actually tells us. Let's step back from speculation and focus on what we can verify. Operation High Jump happened. This is undisputed fact. Over 4,000 personnel deployed to Antarctica in December of 1946. The operation was real, large-scale, and officially sanctioned. The operation ended early. This is also documented. The mission was planned for 6 to 8 months. It ended after 8 weeks. The Navy cited weather and logistical challenges. Aircraft were lost. The George I crash is well documented. Other incidents are mentioned in various reports, but with less detail. The exact number of aircraft lost or damaged remains unclear due to incomplete records. Richard Byrd made unusual statements after returning. The El Mercurio interview is real. The quotes about threats from the polar regions exist in the original article. Byrd later tried to downplay or recontextualize his statements. Substantial portions of Operation High Jump documentation remain classified. This can be verified by requesting documents through Freedom of Information Act. You will receive heavily redacted versions with key sections withheld. The Antarctic Treaty was signed and enforced. This is historical fact. The treaty remains in effect today, with nearly every nation on Earth as a signatory. These facts don't prove any specific conspiracy theory, but they do prove that something unusual happened. A massive military operation was launched, ended abruptly, and was followed by decades of secrecy and restrictions. The commander of that operation issued warnings that didn't fit the official narrative, and the location where it happened remains the most controlled territory on Earth. Now let's consider the theories. Theory 1. Official story. The mission was routine, ended due to predictable challenges, and the secrecy is just standard military protocol. This theory has problems. The Navy planned extensively. They knew the challenges. Ending early was expensive and embarrassing. Byrd's warnings don't fit. The continued classification after 70 years doesn't make sense. Theory 2. German holdouts. Nazi remnants operated from Antarctica with advanced technology, which American forces encountered and couldn't defeat. This theory has bigger problems. The logistics of maintaining a secret base are implausible. The technology gap is too large. No evidence of resupply operations exists. The timeline doesn't work. Theory 3. Non-human contact. Operation High Jump encountered evidence of non-human intelligence operating in Antarctica. This theory is the most extraordinary, and thus requires the most evidence. But it explains everything: the scale of the operation, the early termination, Byrd's warnings, the classification, the treaty, the ongoing restrictions. The problem is the same problem that faces all extraordinary claims. Where's the proof? If non-human intelligence is operating in Antarctica, where are the clear photographs? Where are the recovered artifacts? Where are the first-hand testimonies from credible witnesses? The answer conspiracy theorists give is that such evidence exists but is classified, that witnesses have been silenced, that recovered materials are held in secure facilities, but this is unfalsifiable. You can't prove something doesn't exist if all evidence of its non-existence can be dismissed as part of the cover-up. So we're left with questions and incomplete answers. Something happened during Operation High Jump. Something significant enough to end a major operation early. Something classified enough that records remain sealed. Something important enough that an international treaty was negotiated to restrict military activity on an entire continent. What was it? Unless the classified files are opened, unless witnesses come forward with verifiable evidence, unless someone decides that the truth is more important than the secret, we may never know with certainty, but the questions endure, and Antarctica keeps its secrets. Part 9. The loose ends that don't tie up. There are details about Operation High Jump that don't fit any neat narrative. Small things that get overlooked in the big conspiracy theories but might actually be the most telling. Start with the personnel. Over 4,000 men participated in High Jump. Most of them were regular Navy personnel, sailors doing their jobs, pilots flying missions, engineers maintaining equipment. When they came home, they went on with their lives, got discharged or reassigned, married, had families, lived normal post-war American lives. And yet, decades later, some of them talked about strange experiences. Not in official testimony, not in formal interviews, but in conversations with family members, in letters, in diaries that surfaced after they died. There are dozens of accounts from high jump veterans describing unusual phenomena. Lights in the sky, equipment malfunctions that couldn't be explained, orders to avoid certain areas without explanation, debriefings where they were told never to discuss specific incidents. These accounts are anecdotal, they can't be verified, but they're consistent. Independent witnesses describing similar experiences without coordination. Consider the case of John Searson, a Navy photographer assigned to one of the Martin Mariners during the coastal reconnaissance missions. Searson kept a detailed personal journal during high jump separate from official logs. After his death in the 1990s, his family donated his papers to a military history archive. The journal contains routine observations about weather, base life, and photography assignments, but there are 3 pages that have been carefully torn out, not roughly, as if damaged, but deliberately, cleanly removed. The pages before and after the gap contain entries dated January 16th and January 23rd, 1947. What was on those missing pages? What did Searson see during that week that he later decided should not be preserved? We can't know, but the missing pages tell us that something happened worth hiding. Then there's the issue of the submarine Senate. Why was a submarine part of Operation High Jump? The official answer is ice reconnaissance. The Senate was supposed to test submarine operations in Antarctic waters, gather data on ice formations from below, and evaluate the feasibility of under-ice navigation. But the Senate's patrol routes, as documented in declassified materials, show some unusual patterns. The submarine spent significant time in areas that would have been more appropriate for surface ships. It conducted multiple deep dives in regions where ice reconnaissance would be less valuable. What was the Senate looking for? Why would you need a submarine for a mapping mission? One theory is that the Senate was searching for underwater entrances to subterranean facilities, that if there were hidden bases beneath the Antarctic ice, they would need access from the sea, that the Senate's mission was to locate these access points. Pure speculation, but the submarine's presence and activities remain unexplained. Another loose end, the film footage. Operation High Jump included several photographers and cameramen who shot thousands of feet of film. Much of this footage was used in a Navy documentary called The Secret Land, released in 1948. The documentary is stiff propaganda, typical of the era. It shows brave American servicemen battling the elements, conducting important scientific work, demonstrating American prowess in the most hostile environment on Earth. But several people who worked on the film later said that significant footage was cut from the final version. Scenes that were shot but never included. Film that disappeared or was classified. What was in those scenes? Why was it removed? One former editor claimed in an interview in the 1980s that he had seen footage of aircraft flying over terrain that looked wrong for Antarctica. Green valleys, flowing water, areas that should have been frozen but weren't. He said the footage was confusing because it didn't match any known Antarctic geography. He was told the film had been mislabeled, that it was from another expedition, that it shouldn't have been in the high jump material, but he insisted he saw it. And it bothered him for decades. Again, this is second-hand testimony from someone recalling events decades later, unreliable by any standard. But it's another piece of the pattern. There's also the question of subsequent expeditions. After high jump ended and the treaty was signed, Antarctic exploration continued. Research stations were established. Scientists conducted studies, expeditions mapped previously unknown regions, and some of these expeditions reported unusual findings. In 1964, a Soviet expedition to the Vostok region, one of the most isolated parts of Antarctica, discovered a massive subglacial lake beneath the ice. Lake Vostok is one of the largest lakes in the world, roughly the size of Lake Ontario. It's buried under more than 2 miles of ice and has been isolated from the surface for millions of years. The discovery was fascinating from a scientific standpoint. The lake might contain unique ecosystems. It might hold clues about ancient climates. It represents a sealed environment unlike anything else on Earth. But drilling into Lake Vostok has been controversial. Some scientists worry about contamination. Others argue that the lake should be left pristine for future generations with better technology. And some whisper that there are other reasons for the restrictions. That early drill samples revealed something unexpected. That Lake Vostok is not just an isolated lake, but potentially something more. These whispers are unverifiable, but they persist. Another incident occurred in 1980, when a Navy flight crew conducting routine reconnaissance reported encountering severe electromagnetic interference over a region of Queen Maud Land. Their instruments failed, radio contact was lost, the aircraft barely made it back to base. The incident was investigated. The official conclusion was equipment malfunction, possibly caused by unusual atmospheric conditions. But the crew insisted they had seen something. A structure on the ice that didn't match any known facility. Something that looked artificial, but wasn't on any map. When a follow-up flight was sent to investigate, the structure, if it ever existed, was not found. The official report stated that the crew had likely seen a natural ice formation distorted by atmospheric refraction. Case closed. Or was it? These incidents pile up over decades. None definitively proves anything. Each can be explained away individually, but collectively they create a mosaic of strangeness surrounding Antarctica. Why do so many unusual reports come from one location? Why do instruments malfunction more frequently there than in other remote regions? Why do experienced observers report phenomena they can't explain? The standard answer is environmental factors. Antarctica is extreme. Cold affects equipment. Isolation affects perception. Psychological stress creates misinterpretations. All true, all reasonable, but all also potentially convenient excuses for dismissing reports that suggest something more complicated. Part 10. The truth that remains buried. We've covered a lot of ground. The facts of Operation High Jump, Richard Byrd's warnings, the theories about German holdouts and non-human contact, the treaty that locked down the continent, the loose ends that don't quite fit. Now we need to ask, what's the most likely truth? Let's be honest. The most likely explanation is the boring one. Operation High Jump was a badly planned mission that encountered difficulties and ended early. Byrd was concerned about Cold War threats and expressed them poorly. The classification is bureaucratic inertia. The treaty was rational diplomacy. Antarctica is weird because it's Antarctica. This explanation requires no conspiracy, no hidden technology, no non-human intelligence, just human error, bad luck, and the tendency of people to see patterns where none exist. But here's what bothers me, and maybe it bothers you too. The scale of resources invested in High Jump doesn't match a simple mapping mission. The early termination doesn't match standard military procedure for weather-related challenges. Byrd's specific warnings about threats from the poles don't match concerns about the Soviet Union. The continued classification decades later doesn't match typical document retention policies. The Antarctic Treaty's comprehensive restrictions don't match the strategic value of an empty frozen continent. Each of these things has a conventional explanation, but when you line them all up, the conventional explanations start to feel forced. It's like being told that a series of coincidences just happen to align in a very specific pattern. Possible? Yes. Probable? That's harder to accept. So let's consider a middle ground. A theory that doesn't require believing in flying saucers or lost civilizations, but acknowledges that something unusual happened. Here's the middle ground theory. Operation High Jump discovered something in Antarctica, not technology, not intelligence, but a natural phenomenon that was strategically significant. Maybe a massive mineral deposit, uranium or rare earth elements, resources that would become critically important in the coming decades. Maybe a geographic feature with military applications, a natural harbour that could support submarine bases, a location perfect for secret installations, maybe evidence of geological instability, signs that portions of the ice sheet could collapse, raising sea levels catastrophically. Any of these discoveries would explain the classification. They would explain the treaty. They would explain why certain areas remain off limits. And they would explain Byrd's warnings if you interpret them differently. He wasn't warning about aircraft from the poles. He was warning that Antarctica itself represented a strategic threat, a location that could become a flashpoint in future conflicts, a place where resources or geography could give one nation an advantage. This theory is plausible. It requires no extraordinary claims. It fits the evidence reasonably well, but it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the specific aircraft losses. It doesn't explain the unusual instrumental malfunctions. It doesn't explain the persistent reports from multiple expeditions over decades. So maybe the truth is even more complicated. Maybe multiple things are true. Maybe High Jump did encounter bad weather and equipment problems, and also discovered strategic resources, and also encountered something that couldn't be explained with 1940s era knowledge, and also triggered a policy decision to restrict Antarctic activity for multiple reasons. Maybe the truth is messy, layered, and impossible to summarise in a single conspiracy theory. That's often how reality works. Simple explanations are satisfying but rarely complete. The truth tends to be complicated, contradictory, and frustrating to anyone looking for clarity. So where does that leave us? We know Operation High Jump happened. We know it ended early. We know records remain classified. We know Antarctica is restricted. Beyond that, we have questions. What was encountered during the deep penetration flights? Why did Richard Byrd issue specific warnings about Antarctic threats? What's in the classified documents that still can't be released? Why does Antarctica generate so many unusual reports? The answers exist. Somewhere in a file cabinet in a government building. Somewhere in the memories of aging veterans who signed non-disclosure agreements. Somewhere beneath the ice itself. But for now, those answers remain locked away. And that might be the most frustrating part of this story. Not that we don't know the truth, but that the truth exists, documented and preserved, and we're not allowed to see it. Someone knows what happened on those Antarctic flights. Someone has read the unredacted reports. Someone decided that the information should remain secret for over 70 years. Why? What could possibly still be sensitive about a mission conducted in 1947, using technology that's completely obsolete in a geopolitical context that no longer exists? Unless the discovery is still relevant. Unless what was found in Antarctica is still there. Unless the reason for secrecy in 1947 is still the reason for secrecy today. That's the implication we're left with, that whatever Operation High Jump encountered is not historical, it's current, and that's either very exciting or very concerning, depending on what you believe is down there. Closing. The continent that keeps its secrets. Operation High Jump remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the post-war era. The largest Antarctic expedition ever mounted ended abruptly after less than 2 months. Aircraft were lost under circumstances that were never fully explained. The mission commander issued warnings about threats from the polar regions that made no sense in context. Records remain classified 75 years later, and the entire continent where it happened was placed under an international treaty that restricts military activity and limits access. These are facts, not speculation, not conspiracy theory. Facts that anyone can verify through official records, historical documents, and treaty archives. The question is what those facts mean. Was Operation High Jump a failed training exercise that ended due to predictable challenges? Was it a military mission to eliminate German holdouts operating with advanced technology? Was it humanity's first modern encounter with non-human intelligence? Or was it something else entirely? Something that doesn't fit into our existing categories? Something that remains classified because it challenges assumptions about our world? We may never know with certainty. The people who are there are gone. The documents remain sealed. The continent keeps its secrets. But the questions endure. And every so often new information surfaces, a declassified document, a deathbed confession, a research team finding something unexpected. Each new piece of information changes the picture slightly, sometimes supporting the conventional narrative, sometimes raising new questions. Antarctica is not done revealing its secrets. There's still more to discover, more to understand, and maybe, someday, the full truth about Operation High Jump will be revealed. The classified files will be opened. The real story will be told. Until then, all we have are the facts, the theories, and the uncomfortable feeling that we're not being told everything. The ice is melting. Climate change is revealing what was buried. Satellite technology is penetrating deeper. New expeditions are exploring previously inaccessible regions. What will they find? Will it confirm the conventional story? Or will it reveal something that changes everything we thought we knew? The answers are coming. Slowly. Glacially, you might say. But they're coming. And when they arrive, we'll finally know what happened during those 58 days in 1947, when the largest Antarctic expedition in history encountered something that made it turn around and flee north. Something that Richard Byrd tried to warn us about. Something that still lies beneath the ice, waiting. What if the greatest secret on Earth wasn't hidden among the stars, but buried beneath our feet for billions of years? What if we never discovered it? We just accidentally woke it up. Before we dive into today's story, I want to give a massive thank you to Jeff Anon and so many others who suggested this incredible premise. Your ideas keep this channel alive, and I'm constantly blown away by your creativity. If you have story ideas you'd like to see brought to life, drop them in the comments below. Now, let's descend into the zone of silence and uncover what should have stayed buried. Part 1. The Fall, July 11, 1970. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Voss learned that truth the hard way as his boots hit the scorched earth of northern Mexico, 50 miles south of the Texas border. The air shimmered with heat, warping the horizon into a liquid mirage. Around him, the Mapimi Desert stretched in every direction. Endless, hostile, and utterly silent. Too silent. "Colonel, we've got the coordinates locked," said Sergeant Hayes, squinting at a handheld GPS unit that looked absurdly modern against the ancient landscape. 2 clicks northwest. But sir, the locals are already talking. Word travels fast out here. Voss nodded, adjusting the brim of his cap against the brutal sun. They'd landed 3 helicopters 20 minutes ago, 2 Hueys and a Chinook, ostensibly for a routine recovery operation, after an Athena RTV missile went off course during a test launch from Green River, Utah. The official story was clean. Malfunction, trajectory error, harmless debris scattered across uninhabited desert. The truth was considerably more complicated. "Get the perimeter established," Voss ordered. "No locals inside 500 meters. Tell them it's radiation protocol. And Hayes? Sir? Make sure the science team stays close. Whatever we're pulling out of that crater, I want it documented, catalogued, and on a transport back to Los Alamos before sunset. Hayes saluted and jogged toward the waiting convoy. Voss turned his attention to the plume of dark smoke rising from the northwest, the impact site. According to telemetry, the Athena missile had carried standard test payloads, inert warheads, atmospheric sensors, nothing exotic. But 3 separate tracking stations had registered an anomaly in the final 30 seconds before impact. A second object. Something had been travelling alongside the missile, matching its trajectory with impossible precision, before both slammed into the desert floor at terminal velocity. Voss had read the classified brief twice during the flight from Kirtland Air Force Base. He still didn't believe it. Satellites didn't just appear out of nowhere, and they certainly didn't manoeuvre without propulsion signatures. 20 minutes later, he stood at the edge of the crater. It was wrong. Craters from missile impacts followed predictable patterns. Circular depressions, radial debris fields, scorched earth in concentric rings. This crater looked like something had been extracted from the ground rather than driven into it. The walls were smooth, almost glassy, with a faint iridescence that reminded Voss of oil on water. At the centre lay twisted fragments of the Athena missile. Recognisable alloy panels, shattered guidance systems, a crumpled fuel tank, and something else. "Jesus Christ!" whispered Lieutenant Fisher, the team's metallurgist. He knelt beside a piece of debris that didn't belong. It was roughly the size of a car door, curved like a section of hull, but the metal was unlike anything Voss had seen. Smooth as polished obsidian, dark grey, with threads of crystalline material running through it like veins. Where sunlight struck the surface, faint geometric patterns seemed to pulse just beneath. Fisher reached out with a gloved hand. "Don't touch it!" Voss snapped. "Sir, I'm just... Don't touch it." Fisher pulled back. They all heard it then, a sound so low it was more felt than heard, a subsonic hum that resonated in their chests and made their teeth ache. 18 cycles per second, Voss would learn later. The exact frequency that triggers primal fear in human neurology. "Get the containment team down here now," Voss said quietly, "and somebody find me the Mexican liaison. We're going to need official cooperation to keep this quiet." That liaison turned out to be Arturo Salazar, a geophysicist from the Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León. He arrived 3 hours later in a battered Land Cruiser, accompanied by 2 graduate students and an expression of barely concealed irritation. "Colonel Voss?" Salazar extended a hand. He was in his late 40s, lean and weathered, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I was told this was a routine recovery." "The crater suggests otherwise." Voss gestured toward the site. "We're securing hazardous materials. Standard protocol?" "Standard protocol involves the International Atomic Energy Agency and transparent communication with host nations," Salazar replied, his English crisp and unaccented. "What I see here is an American military operation on Mexican soil with no oversight and no explanation." "You'll have your explanation once we understand what we're dealing with." "Then let me help you understand." Salazar shouldered past Voss and descended into the crater before anyone could stop him. He knelt beside the strange metallic debris, studying it with the focused intensity of a man who'd spent his career reading secrets from rock and soil. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. "This isn't from your missile," he said finally. "What makes you say that?" Salazar pointed to the crystalline veins threading through the metal. "See these structures? They're not manufactured. They're grown. Dendritic formations consistent with slow crystallization over geological timescales. And the base metal," he leaned closer, "nickel-iron matrix, but the grain structure is wrong. Too regular. Too perfect." "Meaning?" "Meaning this is either the most sophisticated manufacturing process ever developed, or it's not manufactured at all." Salazar looked up at Voss. "Where did your missile actually come from, Colonel?" "Utah." "No, I mean what was it carrying?" Voss hesitated. The brief had been explicit. Total information security. But standing in that impossible crater, Watching the Mexican scientist piece together conclusions that matched his own worst suspicions, he made a calculation. According to radar, nothing, Voss admitted, but according to 3 separate tracking stations, something was travelling in formation with the Athena for the last 30 seconds of flight. Salazar stood slowly, brushing dust from his knees. Then you've made a very significant discovery, Colonel. And if you're smart, you'll let me help you understand it before someone else does. They worked through the afternoon, carefully extracting fragments of the anomalous debris. Each piece hummed with that same subsonic frequency, and each piece displayed properties that violated basic materials science. The metal was room temperature despite sitting in direct desert sun. It was non-magnetic, yet compasses spun wildly within 10 meters, and when Fisher finally ran a spectrographic analysis, his hands trembled as he showed Voss the results. Sir, the isotope ratios don't match anything in our database. Not Russian, not Chinese, not even theoretical experimental alloys. So where did it come from? Fisher met his eyes. I don't know. But Colonel, the decay signatures suggest an age of at least 3 billion years. The words hung in the superheated air. That's impossible, Voss said automatically. Yes, sir, it is. By sunset, they'd loaded 17 fragments onto the Chinook, each piece secured in lead-lined cases despite showing no radioactivity. Voss posted armed guards around the perimeter and ordered the crater filled and graded by morning. Official story: recovered missile components, minor fuel contamination, area cleared. But Arturo Salazar had already pocketed a small fragment, no larger than his thumb, while Voss's team focused on the larger pieces. He'd seen the fear in the Colonel's eyes, heard the tremor in Fisher's voice. Whatever this was, the Americans would classify it, bury it, and deny it ever existed. Salazar was a scientist. He believed in evidence. 2 days later, he delivered the fragment to a colleague at the Instituto Tecnológico in Monterrey with a simple request: full isotopic analysis, crystallographic structure, and complete discretion. The results came back on July 19, 1970. Composition: nickel-iron lattice with embedded crystalline silicon structures. Radiometric dating: 3.2 billion years, plus or minus 50 million. Crystalline symmetry: unknown. Not hexagonal, not cubic. Something else, something impossible. The lab technician who processed the sample noted one final detail in her report. When exposed to electromagnetic fields, the crystalline structures appeared to grow, extending microscopic filaments through the surrounding metal like roots seeking soil. On July 21st, the Monterrey laboratory suffered a catastrophic electrical fire. The building was a total loss. All samples and records were destroyed. On July 23rd, Arturo Salazar boarded a small commercial flight from Monterrey to Durango. The plane never arrived. Official cause: engine failure over mountainous terrain. No survivors. Wreckage recovered after a 3-day search showed clear signs of mechanical failure, a fractured fuel line, possibly due to improper maintenance. Colonel Voss received the news while reviewing preliminary reports at Los Alamos. He read the accident summary twice, then locked it in his safe alongside the growing file labelled Project Echo Dust. He didn't believe in coincidences, not anymore. Part 2. The Pattern. April 2024. Mara Delaney discovered the impossible on a Tuesday afternoon, buried in a dataset that should have been routine. She'd been at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena for 6 years, specialising in atmospheric particulate analysis, the unglamorous work of studying dust, specifically the microscopic debris that rained down from space every day, micrometeorites, ablated satellite fragments, cosmic dust from the solar system's formation. Most of it burned up in the upper atmosphere. The rest settled slowly to Earth, where high-altitude balloons collected samples for researchers like Mara to analyse. It was meticulous work. It required patience, precision, and a tolerance for tedium that bordered on pathological. Mara excelled at it. She was processing sample cluster 014C, collected by a weather balloon over northern Mexico in March. when the mass spectrometer results stopped making sense. "That can't be right," she muttered, leaning closer to her monitor. The isotope ratios were completely anomalous, not just unusual, fundamentally wrong. The nickel-iron signature matched carbonaceous chondrites, ancient meteorites from the solar system's formation, but the crystalline structures were far too complex, too ordered. She ran the analysis again. Same results. A third time, same results. Mara pulled up NASA's open-source meteorite database and ran a comparison algorithm. No matches. She expanded the search to include university collections, private research institutes, and international databases. Still nothing. She sat back in her chair, rubbing her eyes. It was past 7 in the evening, and the lab was empty except for the hum of refrigeration units and the occasional ping of automated instruments. Outside her window, the lights of Pasadena glittered against the darkening San Gabriel Mountains. On impulse, she accessed the restricted archive, a classified collection of samples and data sets that required special clearance. She technically had access, inherited from a previous project studying satellite re-entry debris, though she rarely used it. The database was massive, poorly organised, and mostly contained decades-old Cold War military data that nobody had bothered to declassify. She entered the isotope ratios from sample 014C and hit search. One result. The file name made her pause. Echo Dust. Origin. 1970. Athena Retrieval Zone. Access restricted per Department of Defense Directive 1547. Mara clicked it. Access denied. Authorization required. She tried her credentials. Nothing. She tried her supervisor's credentials, which she technically wasn't supposed to have. Nothing. She tried the lab director's credentials, which she definitely wasn't supposed to have. The file opened. What she found inside would change everything. The document was a scanned report typed on an actual typewriter, dated September 14th, 1970. The classification header read, Top Secret, Just Gel, Special Access Required, Project Echo Dust, Summary of Preliminary Analysis. Subject, Debris recovered from Mapimi impact site, 11th July 1970. Recovered materials consist of 17 distinct fragments, ranging from 0.3 kilograms to 47.2 kilograms. All fragments display consistent composition and structural properties inconsistent with known terrestrial or meteoritic origins. Key findings: 1. Composition, nickel-iron matrix, 73% nickel, 24% iron, 3% unknown crystalline structures. 2. Age. Radiometric dating indicates formation 3.2 plus or minus 0.05 billion years before present. 3. Structure. Embedded crystalline formations display non-natural geometric symmetry